So we've all been there. Last minute fast turnaround client job. We've got to turn up to a location without a scout or a recce, set up, find the frame, shoot a bunch of interviews and somehow pull magic out of our butts. Well, that's what happened on a recent client job. The channel's been pretty gear focused recently, so I want to do a breakdown of a professional job, kind of step you through the creative process, the decisions I'm making on the day, and how we arrived on the final shot. We're also going to look at how I color graded it as well, so if that all sounds interesting, let's get into it. So we had a 2-person crew for this project, myself and a camera assistant, but the client was also going to be there on location and they were going to be running the interviews on the day. So I think we did around 5, maybe even 7 interviews. The client wanted the interviews to be delivered down the barrel of the lens, so to camera. That meant that the interviews were going to be, I guess, center framed. Then we also had to factor in that there were going to be multiple aspect ratios for the final edit. So they were going to be delivered in wide, 16:9, and in vertical, 9:16. Speaking of vertical content, I have really been trying to focus and up my social media game lately, especially on platforms like Instagram and TikTok. So I've been diving into some great classes from Skillshare who are sponsoring today's video. As an aging millennial, TikTok hasn't exactly been second nature to me, but classes on TikTok SEO and content strategy have helped me get a better handle on it. And because social media has been a bit of a blind spot for me since starting YouTube, Skillshare's finally helping me give the attention it deserves. There are loads of classes on there, from marketing and video editing to photography and productivity. So whatever you're into, there's something for you. And the best part, you can try Skillshare for free for 7 days, and they also have a great 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, the first 500 people who use the link in the description down below will get an exclusive 20% off their first year of Skillshare. So check it out and start learning today. So I decided to shoot this project on the Blackmagic PYXIS, the 6K. And I landed on that because obviously that camera can shoot 6K open gate. Now open gate's great when you've got multiple aspect ratio deliverables because it's really easy to crop and reframe with that larger open gate format, the 3x2 frame. But also because it's in 6K, so even on the wide, because we were just shooting these interviews on a single camera, that would give us a bit of extra resolution to punch in and give us, if we needed, a second camera angle. We shot this on a 40mm DZOFILM Arles. I think the 40mm is one of my favorite focal lengths for shooting most interviews on. It gives you, the wideness and the context of a 35, but it just goes a little bit extra, gives you a little bit more compression, a little bit more intimacy, and just helps, separate your subject away from the background. The client did send through a couple of photos before the day of filming, which helped sort of, set expectations and understand the layout of the room. But in terms of like lights and camera angles and stuff like that, it was very much get in there on the day and figure that out as quickly as possible. The main feature of this room was like a long row of windows on either side running parallel to each other, and then sort of, 2 smaller walls at either ends. Shooting against the walls was a bit of a no-go. There was a huge TV on one, and then on the other, it was just a bit of a messy wall. It wasn't a perfectly flat surface, and it was just a bit dull. And the lighting around the room wasn't going to be changing too drastically. It was very overcast. So we ended up closing the curtains on the back wall and basically setting up the camera to shoot into the other windows, placing our subject in between. Those windows basically just looked out into a bunch of buildings. So there was a bit of a risk that if the sun suddenly got really bright, it would basically beam all the light onto those buildings, which would act as a big bounce source and basically beam that light back into the camera. So that was a bit of a risk. And then obviously the exposure of those windows was a big sort of worry for me in terms of the fluctuating brightness. Even though we did have a 600D in our kit, a Godox 600D-M, I think that's like a 700 watt light. It's very punchy. We were planning to heavily diffuse it just to get like some really nice soft light on our subjects. So that does suck a lot of output from that light. So that was a bit of a tension there. And I think there's always these tensions on the day, balancing creative choices with technical realities and knowing, when to commit and when to make decisions and what risks to take. So we had to go drawing the curtains and placing the subject against those. Again, bit boring, flat. The curtains were quite nice and red, but again, lighting didn't feel very motivated. It just could have been anywhere. So I had the idea of just like drawing the 2 curtains into a central column behind the subject. And then suddenly, that was it. We finally realized that was a shot. It would basically solve any issues we had with strong overexposed backlit windows, distracting from our subjects. It would add some nice contrast to the frame, some nice interest. It would help break up and add more symmetry to that background, contrast between the light and the dark, and then also some nice deep red tones, giving, quite a dramatic feel to the shot. So then we were just finessing the framing. If you're shooting just a 16:9 frame, you'll have a certain smaller amount of headroom between the top of the frame and the top of your subject. But with vertical, you tend to need to leave a little bit more because you want your subject's head or eye line slightly more centered in the middle of that vertical frame than you don't want them on the edge at the top. So exposed the camera for the background for the windows, and then we basically built the lighting up from there. Our key was a Godox M600D with an Aputure light dome 150. This is a recent addition to my kit. I absolutely love it. It gives you this kind of like soft book light feel, but without any of the hassle or faff of having to set like a book light setup. But the one caveat is that it obviously does eat a lot of output from your light. So even though we've got quite a punchy light for a setup like this, we were running it close to 100% for most of the day to combat those windows because we were dragging down the exposure on the camera. So we had to push more light onto our subject. So the goal was obviously to get a really nice, soft, flattering key with some shape and dimension on our subjects. And then we'd also add a little subtle hair light to help the subject, just pop out from the back. Obviously, the windows themselves did give a lot of ambient room tone, also a bit of backlight as well. But we just added a tiny little ZHIYUN X100 RGB as a kicker just to add a little bit more and wrap that edge light around the face. So I think we had that with a reflect dish, I think maybe like 10-20%. Daylight balance at 5600 Kelvin. So on the PYXIS, I was using my Mofage Poco PL adapter, which also has the drop-in ND solution. And I think we had around 1.2 of ND in there, so quite a lot. And then the lens itself was at T2.8 and the camera was set to around ISO 400. One of the best last minute decisions was that we used a Godox LED panel, which we set flat on the ground behind the subject, and we just sort of propped it up with some sandbags. And that basically just pushed a little bit of light onto the curtains behind the subject. It was subtle, but it just gave us this little extra detail, this little extra halo that just made the shot feel a little bit more polished and just added a little bit more interest and drew attention in the eye to the subject. And this is really important of like scheduling on the day and giving yourself enough help. So I had an assistant, we had enough time to set up. It just gave us enough head space to sort of experiment and try things out and obviously land on this little detail before we had to start shooting for the day. I think the addition of it just really ties the shot together and just elevates it a lot more than it would without. The light outside stayed mostly consistent, but during the brighter moments we were just able to rip the grid off the key light, and that helped us push a bit more output onto our subjects. We also had a big floppy serving as our negative fill, and we could also just walk that in closer or further back depending on how much contrast we needed to place on our subject. So if we were ripping the grid off, we walked it in a little bit closer just to add a bit more contrast and shape to the lighting on the subject's face. We were making sure that we were keeping things simple, keeping ourselves nimble and not overstretching ourselves. So we just got a key light and a backlight and then one accent light lighting up the curtains as well. It's nothing fancy. I think like communication with the client is a really important thing to sort of highlight here. So obviously every decision we're making, we're sort of collaborating with the client, we're showing them what we're doing, we're talking to them, we're previewing the shot with them, checking that they're happy with it. I've worked with this particular client for years, so we have a really good working relationship. There are different ways of doing stuff like this. You can just set up your shot and then show your client. I think that is risky because you could use up all of your time getting what you think is the perfect shot, and then the client can walk in and say that they don't like it and you've burnt all your time. Because at the end of the day, it's a collaboration. It's the client's project, they're paying for it. You're using your creative nuance to set up and arrive at a shot. So it's a collaborative process at the end of the day. So a quick note on audio, just wanted to keep it super simple. I was monitoring the audio as well as the image. We just use my DZOFILM radio mic packs. You can run a feed into your camera, but also trigger a remote recording on the mic pack itself. And that records in 32-bit float. So you're in good safe hands there. I took on both the edit and the grade of this project, so I was very much shooting with that in mind in terms of lighting and how I was managing the shot and exposure on the day. So obviously with the PYXIS, you've got false color, so I was toggling that on and off throughout the day, and the main thing I was just checking in on were those windows, because I knew as long as those windows weren't clipping, then I could manage them in post. So it was going to be a really easy job just to mask them off and then bring the exposure of those down in post. In DaVinci, the grade was pretty simple. I use my standard node tree that I tend to use on most projects. And I just started by masking out the windows, and then if they needed them, I just basically dropped the gain and the highlights just to balance them out a little bit. In terms of Color, I used Sir's Film Vision 2 Clean LUT. It's just a really quick way of getting some nice, dense, contrasty looks. It does lean a little bit warm, so then I did go into the RAW tab on the B-RAW footage and just pulled the color temperature down a little bit to compensate, added a little vignette, and then finally just tweaked the contrast, reduced the contrast slightly on the final node. And then this is the end result: clean, focused interviews with a visual identity, a little bit of interest going on in the way that we set this up. It's not a super bland interview frame. And obviously we can crop it in very easily for the wide, the square and vertical crops. So that's it. I think the key lessons here are keeping the fundamentals simple, really, giving yourself enough time to set up in the morning, bringing in help to give you enough headspace to make decisions and make those decisions quickly, communicate and keep the client looped in as well. And as well as taking measured risks, push the boat out a little bit, but make sure that you've got backup options in your back pocket to fall back on if you need to. With lighting, make sure you're drawing attention to your subjects, play with a little bit of shape and contrast and color in your frame as well. Make sure you're framing appropriately if your client is asking for multiple deliverables, making sure that the framing works across all of those. Make sure you've got a monitor that has frame guides on so you can check the framing before you get going. If you've got a camera like the PYXIS or one of the LUMIX cameras that can shoot open gate, think about shooting in open gate as well to give you that flexibility across the platforms and allowing you to shoot, in 6K with enough resolution to crop into your shot if you need a second shot in the edit. If you found this useful, please just hit that like button. It goes a long way. And of course, if you're not, please consider subscribing as well. Thanks for watching. I'm Aputure and I'll see you in the next one. See ya.